to call the
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? It is so great to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. It's been an exciting week with Marty Baron visiting the Manship School and LSU. I am so excited about this panel that's been organized. I want to welcome you all here. Thank you for being here. This is going to be incredible. Before we get things kicked off, I want to say a few thank yous. Certainly, I want to thank Professor Drew, Professor Apgar, Professor Page for all of the work that they've done to make this event happen and to bring Marty Baron here for all of you. I want to also give a shout out to Skip Cass. Through his generous donation, we've been able to have events like this and bring in incredible speakers and panelists. So a huge thank you to Skip Cass. I don't want to interrupt the program, but I want to say thank you again for being here. And there will be time for Q&A at the end, so hang on to those questions. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Apgar.
Thank you, Dean. A couple of notes. If you are signing in for extra credit, there should be ambassadors in the back with rosters for you to check off on. Be sure to do that.
There's a traveling sign-in sheet going around.
Okay, traveling sign-in sheet. That's number one. I'd also like to thank Richard Chick Moore, who is a major benefactor of a lot of this speaking series. Unfortunately, could not be here today, but we are live streaming this, and if you want to keep this on hand so you can refer back to it, it'll be on the Manship YouTube channel so that you can see it again and again. We will go to questions from all of you in the kind of the last third of the hour. Most of your classes are 10:30 to 12 in this time slot. Is that correct? Right? So we'll break at about an hour point and for questions, and there'll be a roving mic, and you're free to ask your own questions. And I think those are basically the ground rules. I want to introduce the panel first. Bella Angelos, right here, who is a senior now at Manship, which is hard to believe. She was in my 3001 class, 3103, I guess, several years ago. Professor Lisa Fraser Page, who teaches ethics and the capstone senior class in journalism. And has the added benefit of being a longtime columnist and reporter at the Washington Post. And at the far end is Maddie Scott, also a senior, who has been in any number of roles in journalism on campus. I'm Len Apcar. I teach 3103, the advanced reporting class, as you know, and I'll leave it at that. I'm also teaching an honors class, I guess, in fake news. So the fake newsers that are here, that's great. Which reminds me to tell folks that at the Honors College this afternoon at 4:30, we're going to devote more questions, and Marty has agreed to sit for another interview, not quite as long, focused on Spotlight. And a lot of the questions that come up in the narrative of Spotlight. How many of you have seen Spotlight? Raise your hands high so Marty can be impressed with how well prepared you are. All right, we can ask him all sorts of questions about the cast and the movie. And now I want to just introduce Marty, who has been a colleague of mine over the years. I've known him many, many years, and I'm really thrilled that he is here at the Manship School today. Marty started out as an intern reporter in Tampa, his hometown, at the Tampa Tribune, then eventually went to the Miami Herald as a reporter, and then landed several long-term roles at the LA Times. In fact, he was at the LA Times 17 years. See if I can clip this and quit holding it. Following Robert's instructions. 17 years at the LA Times. Then after the LA Times, he went to the New York Times for a little over 3 years as an editor. Then from there, he went to the Miami Herald, back to the Herald really, but as the top editor for about a year and a half. Then he went to the Globe, which became the heart of the famous movie Spotlight. He was at the Globe for 11 and a half years, and then to the Washington Post, pretty much about the time just before Bezos buys it, and all through the first term of the Trump administration. He's a graduate of Lehigh, this being a university. We were always curious about that. And we've got a series of questions. The students will be the main questioners, and we'll throw it first to Bella.
Great. All right, so I just want to start with the title of the book, actually. Collision of Power is the title of the book. And just like to hear, what does collision of power mean, and what kind of collision are you talking about when you refer to it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you for coming. I feel like a little bit like I'm in the witness chair here. This is really kind of weird. Collision of power refers to several things. Here we had primarily a collision between, early on, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Because of the Washington Post coverage, there was a collision between Donald Trump and the Washington Post. And because of our coverage, there was a collision between Donald Trump and Jeff Bezos. And those are the primary collisions that I'm talking about. And then there were some collisions internally within the Washington Post between myself and the staff toward the end on various issues. But primarily I'm referring to the reference here in the title, which is Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post, those collisions.
Great. And when did you get the idea to write the book, and what was kind of the motivation of sharing this with everyone?
Well, after Bezos acquired us, I realized this is extraordinary. We're being acquired by one of the richest people in the world. But then along came Donald Trump in 2015 as a presidential candidate. And it was pretty clear that we were in uncharted ground at the Washington Post, that this was going to be a historic period for the press, for the Washington Post, for the country, all of that, and that I was going to be at the center of that. And so I figured, we're owned by I'm working at an iconic newspaper, one that's famous for having helped bring down Richard Nixon because of the Watergate investigation. We've got one of the richest people in the world who now owns us. And we've got we had a candidate for the presidency unlike any we'd ever seen before, and then a president unlike any we'd ever seen before. And we were knocking heads because of the work of the Washington Post, and that there's an incredible story there, and that it could be told by somebody from the inside. I didn't know for sure that I was going to write a book, but I thought that it would be a pretty damn good book if it were to be written, and frankly that there would only be one person who could or would write that book, because Jeff Bezos wasn't going to write the book, and he couldn't have even if he wanted to, because he wasn't involved in our news coverage. Our publisher, Fred Ryan, wasn't going to write the book, nor could he have written the book because he wasn't involved in our day-to-day news coverage either. And that there was really only one person who could tell that story. And I thought that, as I was anticipating retirement, I thought it was a story that should be told for the sake of history, because here you have one of the most iconic newspapers in the history of the American press, and you have this president unlike any we'd ever seen before, and you've got this multi-billionaire who owns us, and somebody should tell the story. And there was a lot being written about us, and I felt that, well, there was a lot more to know, and I could tell really the full story. And so when I retired, I decided, well, that's what I'm going to do. And within 2 weeks of retirement, I started working on the book proposal, and it was on from there.
So the opening scene of your book starts with you and your colleague at a confidential dinner with President Trump. And I want to know, what was your thought process going to the dinner, and did you consider not going to the dinner at all?
I consider not going, but it probably wouldn't have been a good idea, particularly since the publisher wanted me to go, and he was my boss, and our owner was going to go. So it would have been a slap against them, not just against Donald Trump, for me not to attend. But I was very, very nervous about this meeting, very hesitant to do it, because Trump is such a transactional person. He figures if he does you a favor, that he expects something in return. And he would see giving us a dinner with him as being a favor, and he would expect something in return. The other reason that I was nervous about it is Jeff Bezos' presence there would signal to him that he had something to do with our news coverage, because it was the four people from the Post who were there. It was me, Jeff Bezos, our publisher Fred Ryan, and then now the late Fred Hyatt, who was the editor of our editorial page. So it would signal to Trump that Bezos was directly involved in this news coverage. And it would, if it became public, if that meeting became public, it would signal to everyone else that Bezos was involved in our news coverage, and he had not been. And we had been telling the world that he is not involved in our news coverage because he wasn't. But this meeting would send a different signal. So I was nervous about it for that reason, is how Trump would interpret it, that he would use it as an opportunity to try to lean on Bezos to change the coverage. And sure enough, that's what he did. So exactly as I anticipated. But the meeting never became public. So
Take a couple of minutes and describe that meeting. The opening scene is pretty detailed and colorful. Can you describe it a little bit about, you were sitting next to Trump as it was?
Yeah. I mean, we went in, there's normal entrance for the press, but we went in through a different entrance so that we wouldn't be detected by the press. And then Bezos was allowed in with a limousine through one of the gates at the White House. So, in addition to us, there was Trump, Jared Kushner, and Melania. Ivanka was supposed to be there, but the Congressman Steve Scalise had just been shot during the congressional a practice session for the congressional baseball game. So Ivanka went instead of Trump to the baseball game. People asked why Trump wasn't going, and he said, Sean Spicer, his first press secretary, said it was for security reasons, but in fact, it's because he was having dinner with us. So, you would have thought that he would have gone to it to just show respect for Steve Scalise, but he didn't go for that. He stayed at the dinner with us. So he boasted about a bunch of things, a lot of accomplishments that frankly were imaginary. They hadn't actually happened, but he boasted that he had beaten the Clinton clan. He boasted that he had beaten the Bush clan because he had knocked Jeb Bush out of the supposed front-runner role during the primaries. He talked about that our nuclear weapons don't work, but that he was going to fix that, things like that. And then I think the most telling moment was when he pulled out a sheet of paper and it had the number 47% on it, and he said that number is from the latest Rasmussen poll, and that's what he won with, and that's where his standing was in the polls at that point. He was that June after being, going into the White House, so June of 2017. He was already just measuring what his public standing was. And he said, I can win again with that. And so it was clear to me that he was going to govern for his base, not for the whole country. He was going to govern so that he could again win 47% in the same way that he won the first time, and that he didn't even need to have a majority support among the country. And I don't think he anticipated that. I think he expected that people who were opposed to him would be forever opposed to him, and that he wasn't going to work to win them over. But during the meeting, he was regularly criticizing the dinner. He was regularly criticizing the Post. I was sitting to his left, and every time he was talking straight to Bezos, who was on the other side of the dining room table. And then every time he criticized the Post, he would like poke me with his elbow, and I was so tempted to go like that, but I didn't. So would not have been good form, and so that was it. I mean, he basically talked. He talked almost the entire time. Bezos hardly said anything, very little. He talked about how much he liked Amazon, how much Melania liked Amazon, and how much she used Amazon. This is a company that he had regularly criticized and said that it was being subsidized with its postal rates and all that sort of stuff. And then Bezos said, "Well, consider me your personal customer service representative." And then he called Bezos the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, as I expected he would, and he said, "Can't you do?" He said, "I don't know if you get involved in the news coverage, but I'm sure you do to some degree." I mean, that's a totally inconsistent statement. I don't know if you're getting involved in news coverage, but I'm sure you do. And can't you do something to make the Post more fair to me, is how he put it. And Bezos responded that he did not get involved in the news coverage, and that if he did, he would regret it for the rest of his life. And then the conversation ended, but about a week later, Trump called me about a story to complain, and then he called me a week later, and I can talk about those if you want me to.
Didn't Jared Kushner call at one point?
Well, he was complaining about our investigation of his contacts with Russians, and he didn't call me personally. In fact, he called my publisher to complain about the coverage, but he didn't contact me to talk about the coverage.
And would all this stuff that did, whatever the timing, as it filtered down into the newsroom to you and elsewhere, did you just brush it off, forget about it, think about it?
Well, I didn't forget about it, clearly. I wrote about it. So, but, sure, I mean, you have President of the United States, who is inarguably the most powerful person in the world, who is trying to put pressure on the Washington Post and put pressure on your owner so that he will put pressure on us. And, you have to take that really seriously. You can't be dismissive of that. And, I think we always wondered at what point would Bezos cave to that kind of pressure? Would he cave to that kind of pressure? Because Trump was talking about initially doubling the postal rates on package deliveries. Then he said it should be triple what it was. Then he said it should be quadruple. I mean, you had the sense that maybe he was making these numbers up. And then he did try to lean on the postal commissioner to unilaterally raise the rates, and she had to explain to him that she couldn't unilaterally raise the rates, that there was a process where there have to be hearings and things like that, and fact-finding and all of that sort of stuff. And so you take it seriously, but my view is that's our job. That's the job of the press, is to hold politicians and powerful individuals and powerful institutions to account. And we're just doing our job. And so we had to keep at it. And I couldn't really worry about, what Bezos might do. And he didn't do anything. So that's the good thing, is he did not interfere, notwithstanding all the pressure that was brought to bear on him. And and despite what Trump was doing, which was trying to attack us, not just as an institution, but attack individual reporters by name on his Twitter account, so that they would, with the deliberate intent of subjecting them to harassment and intimidation and threats of violence, which they did in fact suffered threats of violence. And we just kept doing our job, and that is, I think, the way that we were supposed to do it, to behave and react.
Good answer, great answer. A lot of description.
I'd like to ask just, your book contains a lot of re-reporting, so much as I had to go take notes through.
God, I look at that
very
book, it's
much.
like twice the size with all the notes you put in it. My God.
But you talked to so many people, and I just want to hear, how long did that process take? How did you, map out who you were going to backtrack and speak with?
Well, I kept some notes along the way. I figured that I should keep track of what was going on there. And I didn't know whether I was ever going to use them or not use them or things like that. Kept some documents and things like that. So then when I decided to do the book, first of all, I wrote the book proposal. And the book proposal was essentially largely the prologue of the book, which was describing this meeting at the White House. That took maybe a month to write the book proposal. Then my agent came back and said he said, well, I think we can get a pretty good deal here with this, but maybe if you're willing to do a little bit more work, we could probably get a better offer. And are you willing to do that? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. And so then came this long list of suggestions, which was a little bit more work. And it took months and months and months to redo it and add to it and give a better sense of how the book would be structured and then how the book would read and what the flavor of it and what my feelings were, all of that stuff. And I wasn't really accustomed to expressing my feelings about things that happened, but they wanted to hear that. And so that took some mental adjustment on my part. So from the time that the book proposal was, I started on the book proposal to the last bit of editing was a two-year process. So, and it's the first book I've written, may well be the last book I write, but we'll see. Since I hadn't written one before, I sent a few chapters every time. Whenever I finish a few chapters, I would send it to my editor for comments to make sure I was on track. The first 4 chapters, I just completely redid, except for the prologue. So, and then I started over, and then I was pretty much on track. Because there's a lot that happened, there's a lot that's not in the book, you find yourself sometimes going down a rabbit hole, and it's not that interesting to the general public. I mean, it's something that maybe consumed you in the moment, but it's not that interesting to the general public, and so I scratched all that. So, an example of that would be Ezra Klein worked at the Washington Post. He's now at the New York Times, has his podcast and all of that. Became the founder of Vox, the news site of Vox, and his departure from the Post was a big deal. He took pretty much his entire team, and I talked to Ezra afterwards as part of the interviewing process, and I did discuss it with him, what his thinking was and why he did it, and what provoked him to leave, and why he took all those people from me, and all that sort of stuff, and. It was interesting to me, but I don't know that it would be super interesting to the general public, and so I ended up just striking it from the book.
Marty, I'd like to ask you a question about social media. This is a generation that has grown up on social media, and during your tenure at the Washington Post, you had some conflicts with reporters and their use of social media. Can you talk about those ethical conflicts and how you handled them?
Sure. Well, they are detailed at length in the book. That's some of the other collisions that I describe in the book. Look, my concern has been that we as an institution work collectively to try to produce the best possible journalism. We make decisions together. We try to, let's say with the most sensitive stories, we work on what the headline is, we work on how the stories are written, we work on how what the lead is going to say, the language that is used, the photograph, where it's positioned on the site or in the paper, all of that stuff, and try to take great care with that. And then somebody randomly on the staff decides that they're going to tweet something, and it's not the way we would write it. They didn't consult with anybody. They may have said something that goes well beyond the reporting. They may have said something that's highly inflammatory and provokes a really negative reaction, and that person and that tweet becomes the entire face of the Washington Post. Not all the careful work that we did here, but that one tweet, and then other media starts focusing on that impulsive commentary on Twitter, for example, and we get consumed in a giant controversy that totally distracts from all the careful work that we did and the standards that we want to uphold. And so, my view is that we as an institution have the absolute right to create a reputation for ourselves, to enforce that reputation, to have our own identity as an institution, our own brand, and that you know, somebody on the staff, well, they can have their own brand too. It just better not be in conflict with the brand of the institution where they happen to work. And they can't engage, they shouldn't be able to engage in behavior that creates controversies that are completely unnecessary, totally distracting, and highly destructive of the overall reputation of the institution. And so, yeah, I had some instances of that on the staff, and they resulted in big controversies and lots of coverage. One person quitting to leave, to go elsewhere. Another sort of an uprising with 400 some people signing a petition against me for my enforcement of our social media rules. Decision to have multiple meetings about our social media policies and all of that. And demand to rewrite the social media rules, all of that sort of stuff, which I did not do when I was there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that I feel very strongly about, and I think that social media, a lot of social media behavior can be highly destructive of the reputation of the institution. And, you know, I mean, I think that institution has become like a bad word among many people. They're focused on their own individual expression, their own individual rights, their own individual whatever. This whole idea that, you know, I bring my whole person to the work. You know, I can't be one person at home and somebody else at work. And my view is, well, if you want to bring your whole person, well, that's fine, but bring it in and express it internally within the organization. If you don't think we're covering things correctly, well, fine, share that with people. Go talk to the editors, go talk to the reporters, make a phone call, visit them personally, get on Slack, whatever it might be, share your opinions. But don't go on to social media to go criticize your editors. Don't go on social media to criticize your colleagues who sit a few desks away. And so that's an impossible workplace environment where you have people going onto Twitter to criticize their fellow journalists.
Could you give a specific example for the students who may not be familiar? For example, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, you had a staffer who wanted to contribute to it, participate in it.
Well, we have many staffers during Black Lives Matter protests post killing of George Floyd who they wanted to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts. They wanted to participate in the protests, Black Lives Matter protests. They wanted to contribute to Black Lives Matter. They wanted to tweet hashtag Black Lives Matter. And the answer to that was all no, okay? You can't do that. That actually violates the written guidelines that we have at the Washington Post. Guidelines, by the way, that were provided to everybody when they started employment and which they expressed no objection to. And if you want to argue against those guidelines, well then fine, argue against the guidelines internally, but don't go just violate the guidelines unilaterally. And so, look, my view is that we're supposed to cover these protests, okay? How can anybody in the public think that we're covering them independently and objectively and honestly and honorably if they see us as participants in the very events that we're supposed to cover? And we have to maintain our distance from that. You know, pick your profession is my view. If somebody wants to be an activist or an advocate, fine, be that. That's an honorable role in American society and American democracy. We have many, ardent advocates of different causes and what have you, and great, they play a really important role. But we're not that, okay? We're, at least at an organization like the Washington Post, we're independent. We declare our independence, and that we're not a participant in the very events that we supposedly are covering independently and objectively. And we're also not a stenographer, okay? I want to make that clear, that we're not stenographers, but we're also not activists. We're something entirely different. Those are two different professions. Stenographer is one profession. Activists and advocates, that's a different role in society. Journalism, at least at an institution like the Washington Post, is something else. Look, there's a long history of advocacy journalism in this country. The journalism in the United States started as advocacy journalism, a bunch of ideological pamphleteers in this country, right? So, but that's not who we, for example, at the Washington Post or at places like the New York Times or at, many of the major networks, that's not who they want to be. And they have every right to say who they want to be as an institution. And if somebody doesn't feel comfortable with that, fine, that's okay, I accept that. But just go find a place where you will feel comfortable, because we don't feel comfortable with you behaving in this way. And we're not comfortable with that because it undermines the very reputation and brand and identity that we wish to establish for ourselves.
Can I come back to that for an instant? At one point, Bezos asks you what the culture of a newsroom reporter, an editor is, and he says, is it kind of like a calling? And you answer, and then he asks again. He says, is this something that is, in your experience, newspaper wide?
Yeah, no, I'm the one who called it a calling. He asked me how people viewed it, and I said I think it's not viewed as not just a job, but as a calling. And he asked me whether that was distinct for the Washington Post, and I said no. That had been the case every single place I'd ever worked. That was common in the profession, and certainly common at all of the places that I had worked. And so, and I think he came to appreciate that after Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Washington Post, during Watergate, when he died, there was a memorial service held for him at the National Cathedral in Washington. It was a huge affair, lots of luminaries there, all of that. Bezos originally wasn't going to come. Bob Woodward sent him a note, an email saying, just making clear just how important Ben Bradley was to the history of the Washington Post. And Bezos responded, I get it. He got on his plane and he arrived. Helps to have a private plane, by the way. So he arrived, and it made a big impression on him because he heard a lot of stories about Ben Bradley and about the Washington Post. And I think he developed a much better appreciation for the culture of a newsroom, what it was about, how people felt about it. And he talked on several occasions after that about how important that moment really was for him. And so, as I recall, it led to that kind of conversation where we talked about journalism as a calling.
Lisa, Maddie, did you?
A lot of your book details several sexual assault cases, particularly Chapter 9, which you write about Stephanie McCrummen, who investigates Roy Moore and the allegations against him. I wanted to know, do you think women should be prioritized over men to investigate and report on sexual assault cases?
I wouldn't put it that way. I think that we should investigate the facts and see what the facts show us, that we should maintain our independence, that we need to look at, at the evidence. I mean, these are very tricky stories. These are the most difficult stories that I've ever dealt with, as I say in the book. And you want to do justice for women who've been subjected to sexual harassment, or worse than that, sexual assault. But you also we have a system of, at least within the court system, we have a system of due process, and you have to listen to everybody, and you have to listen to, typically the man who has been accused of wrongdoing, because inevitably somebody will say, well, I didn't do that, or it was consensual, or nothing happened, or something like that. And I think you have to basically look at the overall evidence, and that is, did the woman who says she was sexually assaulted or harassed, did she tell somebody contemporaneously or shortly thereafter? Was there actual documentation? Did she file a complaint? Did she write in a diary? Those kinds of, did she tell friends, okay? All that sort of thing. Did she file a complaint, a legal complaint? A whole range of things that you want to look at, and then you want to look at what the man has to say. And so, and our standard at the Post was that at least one woman should come forward and be identify herself, have her name attached to it. Because, look, I mean, anonymous accusations are, it's tricky. Is a really good, first of all, people should know, well, who's making the accusation, I think. That is the standard at the New York Times, by the way. If any of you have seen She Said or read the book She Said, that was the standard at the New York Times, is that they needed to have accusers of Harvey Weinstein go on the record, have their names attached to it. And so we required like one person. And then you need to look if there's any contradictory evidence. Because the reality is that while, you know, the vast majority of these accusations are proven to be true, I believe, there have been cases of where accusations were not true, were invented. They were notorious. In case of the Duke lacrosse team, where a woman made accusations of gang rape, turned out to be not true, not documented. It was proved to be a huge embarrassment, particularly for the New York Times. And then the case in University of Virginia, where a woman had a piece a piece was written for Rolling Stone, where this woman anonymously made accusations of gang rape by a fraternity at the University of Virginia. And there were a lot of questions about, you know, this story doesn't hang together. We at the Washington Post actually did an investigation of that. That was in our backyard and in Virginia. And there was a huge amount of evidence that contradicted the allegations that were made in that case. And so we published that. The whole story fell apart, completely fell apart. And Rolling Stone ultimately had to pay. It was a big investigation that was done of how Rolling Stone really screwed that up. And Rolling Stone actually had to pay a very substantial libel settlement in that instance. So our job is to investigate the facts. You want to be totally respectful of the allegations. You want to do justice for women who've been subjected to sexual harassment or sexual assault. You also want to be respectful of the rights of men who have been accused. And that's a really hard thing to do. As I said, the most difficult stories I've ever dealt with. But the idea is to sort of get at as best you can, get at the truth. So look, at the Washington Post, we were the ones who first had the story, the full story of the accuser of Brett Kavanaugh. And you know, the nominee, when he was a nominee for the Supreme Court. And we published that with her name, laying out the details, all of that. We came in for a huge amount of criticism for that. You know, ultimately his nomination was confirmed, and he serves on the U.S. Supreme Court. But we felt that, you know, we had notes that she had kept. She had talked to her therapist. We had those notes. We talked to her husband, who had been told about this earlier and attested to all of this. And so, while there were details that were missing that we would have loved to have, and which ultimately, you know, because they were missing, they heard her case, but it doesn't mean that she wasn't telling the truth. And so we did publish it, and we felt that it needed to be aired. Keep in mind that a Supreme Court nomination is a lifetime appointment. That's for a lifetime appointment, one of the most powerful positions in this country, and we felt it was important to make that known. So it's super tricky. Anybody who's been involved in stories like that should know you know, just how difficult those stories are, and there need to be some standards, and so that's how I would talk about it.
Going again, just bringing something up from the book specifically, you talk about how in high school you volunteered for Henry Jackson, and you kind of lost affinity for politics, and you called yourself an outsider. What was the value that you saw becoming an outsider in your profession?
Yeah, well, it was my the briefest possible interlude with politics was like a couple of maybe a month or so volunteering, and he lost. Of course, he lost the Florida primary, and that was that. So, you know, I mean, my view is that we should be independent. As I said before, I don't think that we should be participants in the events we cover. I think we should have an opportunity to view things with an independent eye. I think that was, we'll talk about it this afternoon, presumably, but I think that was an advantage in coming to Boston and evaluating what was happening with the Catholic Church, is that I was totally new to the community. I was called an outsider. You know, in every other community where I'd been, when you know, people ask me, how is Boston different from the places you've been? And I said, oh, well, in the other communities, they would call me a newcomer, but in Boston, I arrived and they called me an outsider. So, you know, but I could look at things fresh. I didn't grow up in the community. I didn't have any attachments in the community. I didn't have any loyalties. I didn't go to this school and all of that. And I could look at it independently, objectively, and say there's a real story here that needs to be done, and not feel that I was violating any friendships or loyalties or attachments of any sort. And I think that's been super helpful. And I haven't been attached to any politician whatsoever. I don't socialize with politicians. I mean, there's an occasional dinner here or there, that sort of thing, which just comes with the job. But they're not my personal friends, and I didn't work to make them my personal friends. And my view is that we should cover them regardless of their ideology and regardless of whatever my ideology is. That there are things that we should expect of politicians and that we have work to do as journalists in terms of covering them, and that we should stick to that work and understand that work prevails over anything else. So that's my outsider thing, and I do think it's an advantage, and I think it's motivated me to pursue stories without any hesitation whatsoever as to what the consequences will be. There's a great quote that was written by Sebastian Junger, who was the author of Perfect Storm, and he wrote a piece for a magazine recently, and he said, a journalist is someone who's willing to, a genuine journalist is someone who is willing to destroy his own opinions with facts, his or her own opinions with facts, and a genuine journalist is someone who is focused on reality, not on consequences. And he was his primary example was the pullout from Afghanistan. That sure, there were a lot of journalists who were covering that who were probably more sympathetic to Joe Biden than they would be to Donald Trump. But it was a fiasco, and said we needed to describe it as a fiasco, as what it was, regardless of whether we thought it was going to hurt Joe Biden or not. So.
Do you think that people who do have strong personal attachment to political views can be truthful and accurate reporters?
Well, they can have strong views, but they need to be able to separate their views from their work. So, look, police officers have strong views, no doubt, but they need to be able to do their work professionally. Doctors have strong views, no doubt, but they need to be able to treat all people equally, right? As patients. They don't treat people whose politics they agree with better than people whose politics they disagree with. Same thing with a judge. A judge, everybody has opinions. You can't be a person without having opinions. That just comes naturally. So you can't somehow shed yourself of opinions. But when you go to your work, you say, no, I'm going to set those opinions aside. I'm going to look at what the facts are. I'm going to look at, in the case of a judge, what the law is, and then I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to do it the right way. And I think that's true of journalists. Sure, I have opinions, you have opinions, everybody here has opinions, but when you do your job, you need to say, okay, well, I'm putting those opinions aside, and I'm going to go do an honest job here. So.
I want to know what the aftermath of publishing your book looked like. So did colleagues reach out to you and want to discuss certain aspects of your book? Were you marketing your book at events, signing books? What did that look like?
Well, I haven't heard anything from Jeff Bezos. He has this kind of a policy, which I refer to in the book as strategic silence. It's like if you don't have to say something, essentially, don't say it. So he hasn't said anything. So I don't know what his reaction is. I have not heard from my publisher about the book at all either, although we did see each other somewhere, and he was very nice and all that, but I didn't ask him what he thought of the book, and he didn't happen to mention to me what he thought of the book. So as for my former colleagues, most of it's been positive. I haven't heard, at least directly, negative commentary on it. I'm sure that there's some who at the Post who were not happy with it. Probably, for example, I don't know, maybe people who are leaders in the News Guild, because I had some thoughts about them. But they haven't shared those opinions with me. With the public, it's been a very good reaction. Good reviews, good reaction among the public, the audiences that I've talked to. So I've been pleased with the reaction. So, but as I said, Bezos hasn't told me anything, and my publisher hasn't told me anything, and it's okay, I'm not going to ask.
How should students prepare to work in a newsroom? What advice do you have for them?
Well, I have the same advice that I gave to anybody who was applying for a job, for example, at the Washington Post or elsewhere, or when I've been in charge of hiring. And at the Washington Post and at the Boston Globe and at the Miami Herald, I interviewed pretty much every candidate for a job. There were a few exceptions, but for various scheduling reasons typically. But and people would ask me, well, what are you looking for in the people you hire? And I would always say, I am looking for people who are more impressed with what they don't know than with what they know or think they know. And that's how I think of it, is that I want people who have a lot of questions and who are determined or focused on what kinds of questions need to be asked, but not people who think they already know the answers before they've done a lick of reporting. You know, when you do reporting, you discover that the world's a lot more complicated than it seems when you're sitting at your desk, okay? When you're out talking to people and you're hearing their perspectives, when you're looking at the evidence, and if you've done your job, if you're doing your job rigorously and thoroughly, comprehensively, and honorably, you're going to discover that things get pretty complex pretty fast, and that, you know, your suppositions, your pre-existing point of view, can be really challenged, and so I look for people who can handle that, who embrace that, who are more filled with curiosity than with confidence that they already know the answer. I want them to be confident enough to go out looking for the answers, but I really want people to focus on, like, what are the questions that need to be answered here? Think about that. Focus on that. Don't go into it thinking you already know what the story is going to be, and then the so-called reporting becomes an exercise in confirmation bias. And because if that's what it is, and if you're only talking to people you know are going to tell you what it is you want to hear, and you're only looking at evidence that is going to reinforce your point of view, and you tend to dismiss evidence that contradicts it, then you know, I really have to ask, well, what do you mean by reporting? Because that's not reporting in my view. Reporting means you're going to look at everything and take stock of that, and then you're going to tell people what you found. I mean, the reality is that, you know, when we're doing our jobs, we're often seeing the world, even if we've done a lot of work, we're often seeing the world through a keyhole, okay? We don't see everything. Sometimes, you know, we're able to swing the door open and we can see quite a bit more. And on exceptional occasions, maybe with great skill and a lot of luck, we can swing the door wide open and we get to see the total landscape. And which I think we did in the case of the Catholic Church, for example. But you know, at the beginning, you're not seeing everything, and you're always learning more. You know, there's a reason they call journalism the first rough draft of history, because it's the first rough draft of history, and we should remember that it is a rough draft. What we're doing is a rough draft, and there are a lot of things we don't know, a lot of people we haven't been able to talk to, a lot of documents we haven't been able to see, and, you know, approach it with some humility, that we've got a lot to learn. One of the great things about journalism is it allows us to get paid for learning, okay? If we decide, no, that our job really is our job is to tell everybody that we know everything already, well then somehow we don't understand what journalism is, because journalism is a process of discovery, and we should embrace that. And so that's what I look for in reporters, and that's the advice that I would have for people here.
Kind of going off of that, point of views that journalists kind of should have that would be valuable to them, what questions they should be asking. There's a lot of seniors in the room right now who are looking for jobs, on the job hunt. What advice would you give to them for working in a news publication? What should we be doing right now?
Going for a lot of interviews. So, I mean, I think, look, I mean, I think that you should talk to as many people as you can. You should acquire as much experience as you possibly can, actual practical real-world experience. Make as many contacts as you can. I think that, you know, the field is changing dramatically. I mean, it's being totally reinvented. I mean, and that can be exciting. I mean, look, everybody likes stability, but we're just going to have to accept that our field is going to be perpetually unstable. That's the way it is. It's going to be like the tech industry. It's constantly changing, constantly learning new things. Something's going to come along that's going to disrupt our field, the latest being Gen AI. right? So about 2 years ago, nobody was talking about Gen AI, right? Nobody was talking about it. All of a sudden, that's all anybody can talk about, right? Because it's changing everything. And it's not just in the field of journalism, but it's in every field. It's in every field. So we can't be dismayed by that. We can't be discouraged by that. We need to say, okay, well, that's interesting. How do we make use of it? How do we take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the enormous risks attached to AI? So I've been saying regularly now that we need to get comfortable with discomfort. We're going to be perpetually uncomfortable, okay? And because things are going to change every half dozen years or fewer. We're gonna discover that our strategy needs to shift. Our tactics need to shift. And so the people who are going into journalism should recognize that what you know today, it's great, but you're going to have to know a lot more, and you're going to have to learn new things all the time. And be willing to accept that the way we tell stories, the way that we disseminate stories, all of that's going to change. What I think shouldn't change, and this is the advice that I would have as well, is that we should say, how do we preserve our core values, even as we change the way we tell stories, as we narrate stories, the tools that we use, and all of that, and how we disseminate stories. So, but the core values of making sure that our information is verified, making sure that, that we've maintained our independence, making sure that we are, we have fidelity to the facts and to the truth, to putting things in proper context. That we should never let go of that. And we should say, how can we adhere to those principles, those standards, and all of that in a radically different media environment? Because technology is just going to continue changing our field, whether we like it or not. We just have to accept it.
Let me follow up on that for a second. Early in the book, I think, the publisher comes down to talk to you about quick turnaround stories, 15 minutes, get a story out in 15 minutes, maybe less, quick notifications. This is, I think, clearly coming from Bezos, but he also uses that word that editors hate to hear, metabolism. There's a metabolism, deficiency in the newsroom. Can you talk a little bit about how you handle that? Because in some ways you seem to have dodged that quick response, fast turnaround journalism that doesn't really reflect core values.
Well, I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I mean, first of all, I didn't dodge it. We turned our things around like super fast. We did not, so the background is that, yes, our new publisher, Fred Ryan, about a year after I'd been there, he talked about how we had a metabolism issue, which I did not like hearing because I didn't think we had a metabolism issue. And then when we started with some new initiatives with Bezos, and he had proposed that we have some sort of overnight team, and that we would just aggregate what everybody else did, because we didn't have a national staff at the time, and that we would just aggregate other people's stories overnight, turn it into a quick turnaround, and that we would measure everybody on that they would turn these stories around in 15 minutes. With a night crew that would come in at 10 o'clock at night and leave at 6 or 7 in the morning. And it's like, that's a disaster. I don't know how I'm going to get anybody of any caliber to work those hours. I don't know why anybody would take a job like that. And that's like the worst possible job and the worst possible product in my view. But we hired a guy to run we did create a night unit. And we hired a guy by the name of Fred Barbash, a very experienced journalist from the Washington Post. He had gone elsewhere, but was interested in coming back. He had the great advantage of being highly experienced and the other advantage of being an insomniac. So he was perfect for this job, and he was a great mentor to young journalists. And we hired for that job a lot of people who were working for alternative weeklies. So at alternative weeklies, it's interesting. They can, like the daily newspaper will be writing about a story all week long, and then an alternative weekly will come in and write the story that may be the most interesting story because they have some new angle and they wrote it in a really special way. We don't see much of that now because a lot of the alternative weeklies have gone out of business. But it was a huge advantage. So the way that Fred described the mission is exactly what we did, which he said, we do second day stories today. So the story that you want to see like 2 days or 3 days from now, we're doing it today. We're doing it tonight. And so we had a great crew of people, and we turned it around. We did not measure by every 15 minutes. I was never going to do that. And those stories were so well written, so well done, that they were some of the biggest traffic drivers that we had. And because we drove traffic so well, I mean, yes, the publisher did again come down and talk about this turnaround, and I said, what's the problem? We're getting all this traffic. There's no problem to be solved here, and I'm not doing it, by the way. So, but in terms of fast turnaround, we were measured in terms of alerts, okay? It was a really punishing metric that we had. Our tech team had, the technology department had come up with a metric to measure us against our competitors, how fast we put out alerts. And it was ranked, that's all. It was just ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so if you were 2, it didn't matter. You might have been just 5 seconds after the competitor, but you were 2. You could be 15 minutes after them, maybe 2. And that was just a awful metric, but it's one we ended up having to live with. And so we got measured, and if we went 2 weeks without being number 1 or 2, I would hear from our publisher about it, and I wrote a whole long memo about why this metric was flawed, and there were all these anomalies, and even the way you measure, like when somebody receives an alert, can very much depend on like the sequence of like how these things get sent out, and what device you were on, and all this sort of stuff. I had I didn't persuade him of anything, and we were stuck with this thing. And but usually we were 1 or 2 at the time, and but it was a brutal, punishing metric that was exhausting. I mean, truly exhausting. And so so we did some of it. We didn't do others, but we clearly had to respond. But I mean, look, I mean, in terms of our values, it all needs to be accurate. It all needs to be in context. It all needs to meet our standard, our journalistic standards. And you don't put out an alert before you know that it's accurate. I mean, so speed is a huge problem in our business right now because it does put enormous pressure on people, and the risk of error is far greater today than it has been in the past.
Speaking of speed, before we throw it open to questions, what was the Marty Bot?
Yeah, so there was a bot that was named after me. So
By the staff, not by you.
yeah, well, by the technology department, yeah. So, and it carried my picture, by the way. When we were becoming much more digital, we evaluated like when does the public actually read us, and how should we sequence the posting of stories on our site. We always wanted to have something there early in the morning as soon as people got up, that when they looked at it was something totally fresh. And then of course at lunchtime, this is when people were still going into the office, so there were more normal hours. So lunchtime, readership would go up again, and then pretty much right after dinner time, it would go up again. And you did not want to be posting stories at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock at night because most people were going to sleep. So, and then we were thinking through, like for foreign, if we wanted a foreign audience on a foreign story, we were thinking about hours overseas, particularly in Europe. So, so basically, at every meeting we would talk about, this story is going to be at this time, this story will be at this time, and people would talk about it. And every department had the responsibility for posting things according to that schedule, so that we would be posting when people had a greater propensity to read it. And so, so the question was, how do we make sure that the reporters actually meet their deadlines? And so, and I suggested that that maybe we could just give them an alert that they have a deadline coming up. And so our technology team created a bot that was, basically activated by the budget, the list of stories we were going to do for that day, and every story was assigned a time, and the reporter, and so when the story was due, they would get this bot, which they didn't tell me they were going to do this, but they called it the Marty Bot. It was called Marty Bot, and it had my face on it, and it said your story is due in whatever, half an hour or something like that, and it would remind them if their story was late. So I don't know if it survives or not, probably not, but anyway, they did it without my it was totally not consensual. So that's all I can tell you that.
Very funny, very funny. The roving mic. Who's got the mic? Raise your hand. There you go. Who's got the first question?
Hi, I'm Judith Sylvester, a longtime faculty member here and an ethics teacher, so I have covered a lot of what you've done in my classes for quite a while here. But I wanted to ask you, given all of the turmoil that's going on at the Washington Post recently, the creation, I guess, of a different type of newsroom, and then just the newspaper, in general, survival in general, is what do you foresee the future of newspapers, and particularly the Post, especially if they have to cover another Trump term?
Well, I think as long as we have a democracy, we're going to have news coverage. I think people are going to need to know and want to know what's happening in their country, what's happening in their communities, and what's happening around the world. I think the way that stories are going to be told will be significantly different from the way we do it today. I think we're already in a much more visual era, and stories will be told with many more visuals than they were in the past. And my assumption, my operative theory is that that stories will include a very mix of tools. So there might be a video, there might be text, then there will be a motion graphic, annotated documents, you name it, whatever works best at that particular point. A little bit like a pictogram with different things being used to tell the story. And that will become much more common. Obviously, it needs to work well on a mobile device, and I think we're moving in that direction. Look, the very fact is that we're seeing a radical reinvention in the way that consumers get news. That's going to require a radical reinvention in the way that we tell stories, and in the way that we communicate information, and the way that we disseminate that information. That's just the way it is. So, those people who are able and willing to make those changes, to adapt and embrace those changes, not just adapt to it, but actually embrace them and pioneer those changes, they can do exceptionally well in the field. The economic model, I think, will continue to be challenged. I don't think we're going to be seeing a lot of print newspapers anymore. And people have been predicting that for a long time, myself, and I stopped doing that now. But it's pretty clear, looking at the trend, that physical newspapers are not going to be around for very long, except maybe in small communities with an older population where they prefer that. But it's just not an efficient model. So, I think that's what the Post is struggling with right now, and I think every news organization will struggle with that. Is to how do we address that? How do we do it? How do we do it with greater agility? How do we do it more quickly? How do we do it more effectively? How do we make money on it? That sort of thing. And I don't know exactly what the answers are, except that we're already in a period of exceptional experimentation on that. And some people are showing some promise, and I'm happy to see that. And we see new sites that have emerged at the national level. We've seen new sites, including nonprofit sites, emerge at the local level. We've seen commercial ventures be successful as well. And so, I don't know that I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but I like to be optimistic, and I think that innovation can lead to a solution. I don't know exactly how it's all going to shake out, but we'll have to wait and see. And so, I think, as I said, I think as long as we have a democracy, we're going to have news coverage. The important thing is to make sure we have a democracy.
Next question. Upstairs, downstairs?
I'm going to ask a quick question, and then I think Professor Apgar has some books to give away for maybe the students who ask questions after this. Marty, can you, obviously, trust in the media's been declining for decades and accelerated perhaps with Donald Trump's fake news claims. Can you talk a little bit about how you think journalists and the media can regain some degree of public trust?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue. I mean, I think we have to put it in broader context, and that is that trust is declining in virtually all institutions that are pillars of our society, that have been pillars of our society. It's certainly nothing to boast about, but trust in the press is somewhat higher than trust in Congress. That's certainly nothing to boast about. But trust of the presidency has declined, trust in big business has declined, trust in the medical establishment has declined, trust in institutional religion has declined, trust in virtually everything has declined, except for the military. So I think it's important to have that context. As for what we can do, I think it's very important that we cover the entirety of our communities and the entirety of our country. Look, there are people with lots of different lives. You have many people who are really struggling in our country. I think it's important for us to get out in all corners of our community and our country to understand what people are struggling with, what their aspirations are, what their expectations are, all of that, so that they see themselves fully and fairly reflected in our coverage. And so that they see that, oh no, this news media, this outlet actually does understand what my life is like, what I'm experiencing, and what my beliefs are. And it's very important that we never demonstrate contempt for anybody, and that we not condescend to anybody. And I think we have a lot of work to do on that front, frankly. So that's step one. Step two, I would say, is that we need to be much more transparent about how we do our work. And I don't mean just transparent about like who we are and what our backgrounds are, but I mean transparent about like, let's show people, not just tell people, all right? So if we have essentially radical footnoting of our stories, I don't want numbers, but with links and all of that. So if we're referring to a court document, let's take people to the court document. Let's annotate the portion that we're talking about, which we can do. We have tools to do that. Let's show people the entire document so they can see that it's not being taken out of context. Same thing with a video. Sure, we want a clip. We can give them the clip, but we can give them the whole video too so that they can see the whole thing and then they can make their own judgment. Same thing with an audio. We can have a clip, but we can provide the entire audio so that people can see whether or not we're taking it out of context. Hopefully not. If there's a data set, well, then we should show them where we got the data. Take them to the government site or some other site that actually has that data so they can see where that came from. So in all of those ways is just constantly, like, essentially footnote our stories and show people that there's actually a lot of work that went into this. So we didn't just sit at our desk and make this stuff up, that we actually did a lot of work. And by the way, and the message being to the public is check our work. Check our work. Here it is. Here's what we did. You want to, so I think we should do that routinely, not just on occasion. I think right now with most media outlets we do that on occasion, and we don't do it constantly. And I think that we should do it constantly. And I've seen, for example, at the Washington Post, there's like graphic storytelling, for example, and one particular person, he always tells the full methodology at the bottom of his graphics, and then he actually has the headline, check my work. And he describes the full methodology. And so if you think there's a problem with the methodology, hey, let me know. And so those are the kinds of things that I think that we ought to be doing, is getting out more in the community and fully reflecting the community. All people. The United States is a very complicated place. A lot of different people, a lot of different lives, a lot of different experiences, a lot of different perspectives. And we need to show people that we're actually interested in everyone and that we understand what they're going through and really work to understand it, by the way. Demonstrate some empathy in the work, real empathy in the work we do, and that we're actually attentive listeners, not just talkers, okay? So I think one of the problems now with cable, for example, is that everybody sees journalists just talking and talking and talking. And what we really ought to be doing is listening, listening, and listening. And that doesn't make television, by the way, but it does make good journalism. And so, and then I think we just need to show people how we went about our work.
More questions. And if you have one upstairs, we could probably repeat it if you want to shout it down. Questions? Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
For someone who wants to start a career in
print journalism, where do you recommend is like a good kind of career trajectory for them to begin with? Like, is it better to shoot very ambitiously for the large kind of national low newspaper, or to start for a local smaller one to kind of get experience and kind of know what they're doing? What is kind of, looking at different internships and things like that, which do you recommend?
Well, I mean, I think starting local is a good thing. I think it gives you more contact with people directly, rather than being at a national shop where they might ask you to just aggregate everybody else's stories, where you can actually go to the courthouse, where you can go to the school board, where you can cover the city council or the county commission, or you're covering an environmental agency, or you're covering the police, or whatever it might be, and develop those skills. I think it's really important to be able to do that. I mean, look, there are some people who just want to cover politics. Well, there's a possibility of getting a job with a Politico or Axios or whatever it might, Punchbowl News or some other site. That's entirely possible, and it might be a really good opportunity. But I do think the sort of the local experience is really, really helpful in terms of finding your way around sort of government agencies and interacting with people on a day-to-day basis, and actually getting out of an office and talking to people. So I think that's a good place to start.
Hello. I had one question. We kind of talked about how, especially during the Trump administration, there was a lot of violence and threat against reporters. So what advice would you give to young journalists and reporters who, although going into the profession with objectivity, might still face those acts of aggression? What advice do you have for dealing with that?
Yeah, I don't know, did everybody hear the question? Yes, okay, all right. Well, yeah, there are a lot of threats. I got a lot of threats, but people on our staff got far more. We really did have to ramp up our security, both at the office and also for individuals as well. And that's really disturbing. It was one of the things that concerned me the most my entire time there, is that something really terrible would happen because people were, frankly, being incited to commit violence. And all it takes is one person. That's it. So, look, I mean, I think it's important to, first of all, always behave professionally. I mean, we were talking about social media before. A lot of times, the most inflammatory comments on social media provoke a really negative reaction and provoke a lot of threats. And first is to consider, well, maybe the reason we have some of the guidelines we do is to protect you from those kinds of reactions. The advice that we would always give to reporters and others is that if they did get this kind of reaction, don't engage. Just don't engage. Just ignore it and move on. Unfortunately, there were some reporters who were just constantly engaging with their anonymous critics on Twitter, which is insane in my view. I mean, who are these people? You have no idea. They're trying to goad you. Why would you let them goad you? Why would you see that they're setting a trap for you and then you say, great, I'm going to dive right in there? So just ignore them. That's the other thing that I would say. Always tell your editors what's happening. Ultimately, they and the institution are responsible for your security. And one of the advantages of working for some sort of institution is that it should have the resources to provide for that security, and it certainly has the responsibility to provide for the security. There are a limited number of things that you can do. I mean, not everybody will go around with a security guard, right? And nobody has the resources to provide full-time 24-hour security for everybody on the staff. But you should be aware of your surroundings. Is there somebody following you? Are you at look, when there was an outfit called Project Veritas that would try to trap people at the Washington Post, get them on camera saying things, engage them, talk to them, get them to loosen up, and get them to say things that they probably shouldn't have said, or they would take something they said and then distort it. They would edit it in a way that was highly distortive. I was always looking for the table that was in the farthest corner. There was nobody around, and where I could see what, was there a young woman there that possibly could have a camera attached to her purse, which is how often they did this, and where I didn't want to be within earshot of other people. So I just then I was just always aware. So when I was in Washington, I could walk to work, but I would try to vary my routes. There weren't a lot of options, but there were maybe 3 options, and I just tried to do that. And people on the staff who were taking their car into work, they were advised to take alternate routes too. So that's not something you typically have to do every day, but if you're under threat, then for a while at least you want to do that. So that's probably about the best that you can do, and don't get goaded into reacting to people, because sometimes you'll be out covering something and then people will say offensive things to you, and you just continue to act professionally. I mean, this happened on January 6th of 2021. You had the attack on the Capitol, and people were attacking the press too. Some people were assaulted, really. One AP photographer was thrown over a banister. The person who did that has just been prosecuted, so it was just charged. And so, but we had reporters who were, people would come up and say, "Who do you work for?" Well, if you said the Washington Post, it didn't go over well. So, and people would just be yelling in your face. And our people just maintained their composure and didn't respond and did not escalate in any way. And so I think it's really important that you not escalate.
Question over here.
Being like that, a lot of us are seniors, and obviously we are looking at different companies and their values and what they, value ethically, all that. What is the most important thing you would say when choosing a company to work for that you should look for ethically?
That they allow you to do your journalism with true independence, that they allow you to do it, to adhere to the core principles of journalism, which is that you're able to do it independently, honestly, objectively, honorably, all of that. They'll allow you to do your research, and they'll allow you to report what you actually find. I mean, they may ask you tough questions. They should ask you tough questions about your stories. That's what you call editing. But ultimately, if your story stands up, they should allow you to publish it. And that's if they don't allow you to do that, if they say you can't publish a story just because somebody's going to be offended, or they think that readers are going to react negatively to it, that I would avoid that. I mean, I've been exceptionally lucky, or if they want you to publish a story because an advertiser wants you to, or something like that. I've never had that, and I'm so fortunate that throughout my entire career I didn't have that kind of pressure. So, and so I would avoid those kinds of circumstances where people don't allow you to do actual journalism, and the way that it should be practiced.
Lots of questions over here. Great.
Hi, I was wondering, because you were talking about like having a hard time reporting on sexual assault cases, as well as a lot of stress from other things in your book, and so I was wondering what advice you had to young journalists on how to deal with reporting on something that might affect them really heavily and might be really emotional to them, and how to get through that and do your job appropriately.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best one to provide advice because I don't get all that emotional about things. So I'm pretty stoic about this stuff. So I think it does require a certain level of stoicism, and
Class letting out.
it's unnerving. In any event, look, I mean, I think you have to have conversations with your editors about what makes you uncomfortable and why, and whether you're capable of covering a story. And if you're not, then you should share that with an editor. But our profession does require covering sensitive subjects, and that's just the nature, because we're covering the real world, and the world is full of difficult circumstances. It's a little bit like being a police officer, and you're dealing with like really horrible stuff that happens on the street. It's just going to be part of the job. So if you're a reporter and you're asked to cover a murder, it's quite possible, it'll be really horrible and very difficult to deal with. And certainly approaching witnesses or family members and asking them questions is going to be exceptionally difficult to do. I think, what I would advise is talking to people who've done it before and how they deal with it, talking to colleagues. I think one of the great advantages, at a time where people don't want to go into an office, I think actually one of the great advantages of being in an office is that you have colleagues around that you can talk to and benefit from their experience. And going to lunch or breakfast or drinks or whatever it might be with a colleague and saying, look, I'm dealing with this kind of story. It's really difficult to deal with. How would you advise that I think about this? That can be really, really helpful. But this, it does require sort of steeling yourself to certain circumstances that are deeply uncomfortable. People are highly emotional, dealing with subjects that are terrifying in various ways, and some of that is unavoidable, but some of it just takes time, dealing with enough of those stories. But I'm not sure I have much better advice than that.
Two more, maybe? I saw 3 or 4 hands. 2 more?
Hi, I'm Julia Goodwin. I'm a senior here, and I'm also in Professor Apkar's book club. And we were talking about last night at the Trump rallies, the reporters kind of being put in pins almost. And you've talked a lot about separating opinion from what you're writing, but how do you separate opinion from a scene like that might seem so ludicrous in the moment to be there?
Well, there's always, for a rally, there's always going to be a place where the press will be. So there'll be cameras and all that sort of stuff. And they don't want people just roaming around the entire convention hall, if it's in a convention hall, and just constantly reaching out to people. Although, you always have the opportunity to interview people independently as they're coming out, and you can do that. So, that's the way those things are structured. It's just as true of Kamala Harris rallies as like a press area. I think it's important to make sure that use every opportunity to get out of the press area in whatever other circumstances. So as people are leaving, as people are coming, as people are, and interview them outside of that to get discover who they are, why they support that candidate, how they reacted to what the candidate had to say, you name it. I wouldn't make such a big deal about the fact that they're in these sort of isolated circumstances, because there are logistics attached to all of these rallies that's really complex, and especially now, always with the Secret Service, but now, of course, after 2 assassination attempts, it's going to be even more so. So, but you always have the opportunity to talk to people afterwards. And look, for a while, Trump banished, during his campaign in 2016, while he was campaigning in 2016, he banished the Post from getting credentials to even be we couldn't even be in that the cage there, or whatever it is. So the area where the press is, and we couldn't be on the plane, and we couldn't do any of that. So we had to work around that. And so we would just go into the rallies as if anybody else, sign up to be in the rally and stand in line with everybody else. You just needed to make sure you got there early enough so you actually got in. And at one point they detected a reporter for the Post, and they told him he couldn't go in, which was just outrageous. And that was being done by local law enforcement, which was extra outrageous, because they don't work for Trump, they work for the public. And they took his phone away, and they took everything away. It's just truly outrageous. But so I would just say those circumstances are not that uncommon for a big rally where you're going to have 10,000 people there, for example, or more. And but look for opportunities to get out and interview people independently.
Was there a last hand?
One up.
Where? Up there. Go ahead, shout it out.
Maybe speak to the effect or lack thereof of rhetoric on specifically the media rhetoric surrounding Donald Trump on the assassination attempts on former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, obviously Trump has tried to blame the assassination attempts on the media. There's no actual evidence that I'm aware of that says that either of these individuals was motivated by media coverage. Trump has used incredibly incendiary language about his opponents. He's described the press as vermin, garbage, lowest form of life, enemies of the people, you name it, everything like that. And he's described his political opponents with incredibly strong and strong language as well. People he felt should be imprisoned, you name it. So you can't really attribute these assassination attempts to anything that any one person said, whether his political opponents or the press. And I would say that that's just a political maneuver on his part, is to find somebody to blame. I mean, the reality is that the Secret Service is dealing with threats all the time against political figures. Trump's not the only one. There have been threats made against not assassination attempts, but threats of harm to Biden and to others. And in reality, if you look back, actually the Washington Post did a project on the failures of the Secret Service some years ago. They won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was about you can go look it up, and it was written by Carol Leonnig, and it disclosed the incredible failures of security in protecting Barack Obama, exposing him and his family to real risk. And the director of the Secret Service had to resign as a result of that coverage. And so, the Secret Service has failed with Democratic president. It clearly failed in its protection for Donald Trump. And I don't know that you can attribute that to, people saying that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. I mean, a lot of the measures, we have to deal with the reality, right? So a lot of the measures that he has actually proposed and said that he would implement if he were to become president are exactly the kinds of things that you see in authoritarian governments elsewhere. That's just a fact. Talking about using the military to suppress legitimate protests, talking about putting your political opponents in jail, talking about weaponizing the government to go after them, talking about this whole, talking about putting journalists in jail because they're viewed as traitors and that they've engaged in treason, withdrawing the broadcast licenses of outfits like NBC and ABC now because he didn't like the coverage. That's what you see in other countries which have authoritarian regimes. And I don't think that there's anything wrong. In fact, I think there's everything right with pointing out that those are the measures that we see in authoritarian regimes elsewhere. And I don't think that you can attribute these assassination attempts to any one thing that the media has done. And I think that's really just primarily a political maneuver by Donald Trump.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Marty in a big way. An hour and a half nonstop of answering questions, drinking little water. Panelists Bella, Professor Lisa Fraser-Page, and Maddie Scott, thank you all very much. Really excellent questions in preparation. They are book club members too, I might add, and had read the book and discussed it over 8 weeks, I think it was, last semester. There's another book club that just got off the ground a couple weeks ago, interrupted by the hurricane, and maybe we'll do a third book club again in the next spring. Marty was always gracious. He zoomed in after the first book club and answered questions for another hour back last March. So we're really happy to have you here physically, and it was a great session.
Thank you.
Lots of terrific advice. I do have 3 books. If you asked a question and you're still in the room or in the balcony, come on down, and we're going to figure out a little random way to award three books to you. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. Think about 4:30. We're going to talk about Mark Ruffalo and Rachel McAdams and Liev Schreiber and all sorts of interesting things related to Spotlight. All right. Thanks.
Hey.
Hi again,
How are you?
Judith
Yeah,
Sylvester.
hey, Judith.
I just wanted to tell you, I have really